the traditional SEC media voices are even declaring it the Big Ten's day in the wake of Ohio State's national championship and
down bad.
And the SEC not having the same kind of representation, the same kind of success that many expected along the way. Tom, you actually decided to dive into it for a column over on CBSSports.com. How do you see this? Is it an overreaction or is it representative where the Big Ten has a historic finish in the final AP poll, 3 of the top 5 teams? You've got that sort of like top end talent from a school-wide perspective that wasn't necessarily there in the SEC. The SEC did, however, have a really solid middle pack that they will continue to point to, the meat grinder and such. When you shake it all out, take a step back, what does it look like to you?
First off, as a serious journalist, I don't want to put misinformation out there. I did not opt to do anything. I was held at gunpoint by an editor and forced to write this column. So that's what I wrote it. But the conclusion I reached was that no, the Big Ten has not surpassed the SEC. Now, recency bias, obviously. The Big Ten has won the last 2 national titles, and that's kind of what we used to gauge the strength of the SEC for all those years. And you can also say the Big Ten not only won 2 straight national titles, but they've done it with 2 different programs. 2 programs who have traditionally been the 2 biggest programs in the conference, the ones that used to lead to the nickname the Big 2 and the Little 10. Those teams have won it. You can argue, you look at the playoff, the Big Ten got 4 teams in this year. The SEC only got 3. The Big Ten went 2-0 against the SEC in the playoff and went 3-1 against them in the bowls. All these things are true, and all these things point to the top of the Big Ten being very strong this year, stronger than the SEC at the top. Where you really lose the argument, though, is once you get past those top 4 or 5 teams, the SEC is still quite a bit better than the Big Ten. So overall conference strength, the SEC is better. Now, the bigger story isn't that the Big Ten has passed the SEC, because it hasn't yet. The story is truly that we're having the conversation because the Big Ten is really closing the gap on the SEC, and I think there are a lot of forces at play here. One being NIL and the transfer portal. You're no longer allowed. The SEC teams can't just stack up every single 5-star 3 deep on their roster anymore. Those guys are hitting the portal. They are being spread out. But also, we should not overlook the impact of Nick Saban retiring. We talked about the SEC has been the best conference in college football for a long time. Alabama carried a lot of that weight for a very long time. And now Saban is gone, and Alabama is not quite the Alabama it had been. So the SEC, of course, overall, it is going to weaken a bit when you lose Nick Saban. So the gap is certainly closing. It could be 5 years from now, the Big Ten truly is overall just better than the SEC, but it's not there yet.
Is that how y'all see it?
Yeah. Go ahead, Danny.
I mean, hasn't the SEC defined it by who's won the national championship? They've used 2 metrics: who won the national championship and who had the most players drafted. So you've got those 2 years in a row now. You've had the Big Ten. I think it'll be very interesting to see how the NFL draft unfolds if the Big Ten actually gets more players drafted. It was pretty tight last year, especially if you include the newcomers. And if you tell me about more teams, don't tell me that, because the SEC claimed that for the last 20 years when they had more teams than everybody else. Either I would love to make the case and just pound the table and say the Big Ten has surpassed them, but I don't think it has. I think it's close. I think the gap is closing, and I've always maintained this, because even if you were the most ardent Big Ten, pound the table, the Big Ten is the best in the country because we did win the national championship, I would say the same thing that I've said in years past. The gap is not that big between the other conferences. You know, like that's where I always push back. Although I do think with the super conferences, I do think it is starting. It's going, that gap between those 2 and the ACC and Big 12 potentially could widen. But I think the SEC and Big Ten are pretty close. But I would give the edge to the SEC because of the depth.
And I'm not finished. When that your line in the rant.
Yes.
fresh off the plane.
I got more.
Yeah. Because that was about the gap closing, right? When that,
yes.
I'll go back and I'll pull that clip so that we can have it. For those who missed out, David, or so Danny Kanell had some legendary moments on Saturday.
That was our producer being like, give me more. Let's go, get him more. You guys know Noah. Yeah. Noah's always trying to, get he wants a viral clip.
He got it. Yeah. He got it. We may have had medics on standby for a cardiac arrest, but you were able to power through there. But how do you see this one?
I think that the Big Ten, caught the SEC this year, but each year is a year unto itself. I think in college football, especially with the transfer portal now. This year, I think the best Big Ten teams, I think they had a lot better culture in terms of like caring and playing for one another, like actually being. I think they were more team than some of these SEC teams. Like we're just based on like some of the stuff we heard behind the scenes. I didn't hear as much like NIL infighting. Some certainly, some from like behind the scenes Big Ten stuff, but I wonder if these teams like care about winning a little bit more and like are a little bit more selfless. I think that's probably way too broad of a brush to paint with, but anecdotally, and maybe it's because I'm in the South, so I hear more stuff about some of these Southern teams, but I kind of feel like a lot more teams in the South had some like NIL behind the scenes infighting and maybe weren't totally a team from week to week. And I didn't hear that as much from the Big Ten. I don't know if that's something that is A, true, B, portable year to year. I think some of the teams that have real good academics probably is because like there's still some of that like collegiate feel at a place like a Notre Dame or right, exactly, like Illinois, obviously, and I think you hear about it some too with some of these bowl games. Like, yeah, this team like feels like a team. Like they're into some of these like activities where someone's like they don't care to be there, even if it's like not a bowl that a team like that should be blowing off. Like you guys haven't won shit. Like what are we doing? So I think the other thing here is the SEC quarterback play this year was meaningfully below expectation that it would have been in the preseason. And that I don't think holds from year to year.
Right.
The Big Ten may still have better quarterbacks next year, depending on what Sayin is, depending on if Drew Aller makes a jump, if Raiola makes a jump. We'll see what Dante Moore is at Oregon. But ultimately, I think the SEC is very likely to have a couple guys, like the odds say they're going to develop. Whether it's Lagway, whether it's Sellers, whether it's Nico taking a step, whoever plays quarterback for Kalen DeBoer is generally going to have pretty good success, I would think. I know for a fact.
I mean, yeah, you could wake up and we could be talking about the SEC having multiple, first round draft picks.
Ole Miss likes Simmons quite a bit. We'll see if that actually plays out on more than just
a baseball player.
I mean, like, dude, he plays okay against Georgia.
The baseball draft.
Pavia's back. He's not like an NFL type guy, but he's certainly very good for that system. Probably not the guy you can hang your hat on. If Gunnar Stockton can be a dude for Georgia, although Georgia has shown they can win without like amazing QB play. But the guys they've won with isn't Bennett still in the NFL somewhere? You guys told me.
No.
He's out now.
He was on the Rams. I don't think he was on the Rams playoff roster. Could be wrong.
Got it. So I think there's a pretty good chance the SEC bounces back and bounces back probably pretty big next year because somebody's just going to emerge at quarterback. Most likely not all of those guys, but certainly they could.
On the anecdotal side of this, an SEC coach said, going back to, so it was in the portal window around signing day time. He really said, look, this is a 6-month. If we're just signing 6-month contracts. That's just kind of the relationship that we have. And it was embracing the transactional nature of the world that they are living in. And when you've got that kind of attitude from the top down, it is, showing a little bit of realism, but maybe also might have a negative impact on terms of the players also looking at this as a very transactional situation. But here's where I wonder if the Big Ten might be fighting against that. And you've got a good point, at least in terms of some of these universities that are able to create a more collegiate feel towards the way they are being approached. But based on the way that we understand it, this has been the Big Ten sort of waking up to loading up the money gun. Look, the Big Ten has always had big, deep pockets. It's just been about how explicitly those funds are transferred directly towards, player acquisition and things like that. So will the Big Ten then be in a position in a couple years where the SEC is now, where they're just always having to sign 6 months contracts, and that culture edge, that culture advantage is something that is not as present? It's definitely something that I'm keeping an eye on because, the Michigan glow up of all of this billionaire money and, all the different ways that we can go out there and, buy ourselves another run at a national championship is good. as long as they don't end up having to have some of those same issues that you're talking about in terms of what it can do to a locker room. So it's something that I'm looking at because many people credited the he's a funny comedian, so I guess I'll give it to him, the Shane Gillis theorem of like, oh, everybody can pay now, like
Right.
the everybody can pay now has resulted in a huge shift in the landscape. It's like, well, now also it's probably going to bring some more problems along with that. And I'll be curious if that ends up being more of a factor at Big Ten programs in the future once they get a little bit deeper into the paying players part of this world.
They're not losing guys though. You notice that? Like, who does Penn State lose if it's not to the NFL? Who does Ohio State lose?
Players they're okay seeing go.
Yeah, right. Like, who does
Penn
Oregon
State
lose?
did lose its 2 receivers.
Players they are okay seeing go.
Yeah. Like they were ready for Lambert Smith to be gone.
No, but I mean, Harrison Wallace is in, Amari Evans is in. Now they did add 2 receivers in the portal themselves, but still, first off, one correction: Stetson Bennett is still a Los Angeles Ram.
He made the playoff roster. Nice.
In the NFL, you only have 2 active quarterbacks on a game day. Then you have your emergency. Stetson's the 3rd stringer. Going back a little bit of numbers to my article, because one thing I think is kind of worth pointing out, because I used my ranking system that I do for just that's in season only, no projection, just all reactive kind of stuff based on how teams have performed. And I use the same formula on the conferences as a whole. So to kind of really drive the point home, the rating difference between the SEC in first and the Big Ten in second was 1.39 points, which is larger than the difference between the Big Ten and the ACC in fourth by 0.3 points. So the SEC is still very much from top to bottom stronger than the Big Ten. Of course, Purdue really does drag down the Big Ten score a lot, but even so, it would still be a very significant gap, even if you remove Purdue.